The mud at the bottom of the quarry pit smelled like iron and old rain, and Tam could not feel her hands anymore. That was the part she focused on, because focusing on her hands, or the absence of them, the way they had gone to cold nothing somewhere around the 2nd mile, was easier than thinking about the small weight pressed against her chest. The pup was 5 weeks old. His name was Cade. He was not hers. She had taken him from the whelping room 40 minutes ago, when she had gone to replace the heating stones and found him alone in a corner, with his mouth open and no sound coming out, which was the worst kind of silence she had ever heard in her life, and she had heard a lot of silences in the Irongate pack. She had been a stable hand for 7 years. She fed horses. She mucked stalls. She repaired tack. She did not ask questions, and she did not make trouble, and she had been very careful for 7 years to be exactly the kind of person no one looked at twice. Then she had walked into the whelping room and seen Cade, and all of that careful invisibility had simply stopped working. He had been wrapped in a horse blanket, not a pup blanket, not the soft flannel ones she had watched the Luna fold and stack in the cedar chest before the birth. A horse blanket, stiff, smelling of hay and sweat, folded around a 5-week-old infant, whose lips had gone the color of old ash. She had not decided to run. The decision had already been made for her by something that lived further down than thought. The quarry pit separated Irongate from Stormhold territory the way a scar separated 2 pieces of skin, not a wall, not a fence, but a wound the land had not finished healing. The pit was 40 feet deep in places and filled at the bottom with 6 inches of standing water and clay mud that sucked at her boots with every step. She had known about the crossing point because she had spent 3 years as a stable hand before that in the outer barn, the one that sat closest to the eastern border, and the horses knew which way the water flowed. Animals always knew the way out. Her left knee had gone wrong somewhere in the descent. She had felt it give, not break cleanly, but twist, the kind of twist that didn't announce itself as injury right away, but would make itself known later in the long and very specific vocabulary of pain. She was filing that information away for later, because later was conditional on other things going right first. Cade made a sound against her collarbone. Less than a sound, a suggestion of one. A breath that meant he was still forming opinions about the world. "Keep forming them," she told him. She did not say it aloud. Her throat was too dry, and sound carried in the quarry the way sound carried in a cathedral, up and outward, and everywhere you didn't want it to go. The north wall of the quarry was sheer stone. The west wall was collapsed rubble. The east wall had a drainage channel cut into it during some long ago mining operation, roughly the width of 2 men standing shoulder to shoulder, choked with dead vines, angled sharply upward. She climbed it one-handed. The other hand braced over Cade's back, and the vines cut into her palm, and the stone caught her knee on the bad side twice, and she did not make a sound either time because she was Tam, and she had been not making sounds since she was 11 years old, and had learned that making sounds got you noticed, and getting noticed in Irongate was never to your advantage. She crested the top of the east wall, and the wind hit her, and she understood for the first time how cold she was, because the wind made it worse. Stormhold territory smelled different. She had heard this but not believed it. The air on the Irongate side smelled like pine smoke and coal, and the particular dampness of a place where it rained 4 months out of the year. This air smelled like granite and cold water, and above it, threading through everything else, something that her body responded to before her mind catalogued it. Something electrical. Something that said, power is here. Power of a different kind than you know. She was trespassing. She understood that completely. Irongate and Stormhold were not at war. Technically, the way 2 people who have stopped speaking to each other are not, technically, in conflict. The Alpha of Stormhold had not taken a seat at a joint council meeting in 4 years. The Alpha of Irongate had sent no delegation. The silence between them had calcified into something that felt like permanence. A lone Irongate stable hand, crossing the quarry border at 3 in the morning carrying a dying pup, would be read as a provocation, a spy, or evidence of a problem that needed to be disposed of quietly. She kept walking. The patrol found her before she found them. She heard them first. 2 sets of footsteps, different weights, moving with the practiced quiet of people who knew their ground. She stopped walking and stood very still, the way she had learned to stand still in doorways when Irongate's beta, a man named Oscar, was in a mood, and the art was in becoming part of the wall. It didn't work. The wolves were better at finding things than walls were at hiding them. They stepped out of the tree line ahead of her. 2 men in dark patrol gear, the Stormhold sigil on the chest, a lightning-split pine white against black fabric. The taller one had his hand on the hilt of a short blade. The other one was already watching Cade with a different expression entirely. Not suspicion. Something older than suspicion. "Stop," said the tall one. "State your name and pack, Tam." Her voice came out stripped down to the essentials because that was all she had left. "Irongat, I have a sick pup. He's 5 weeks old and he hasn't been fed properly in at least 4 days. Please, I know who I am to you right now. I know what this looks like. I'm asking you to look at him first and decide what I am after." The shorter patrol wolf stepped forward. He pushed back his hood. He was younger than she had expected, mid-20s maybe, with a careful face and careful eyes that went immediately to Cade and stayed there. "What's wrong with him?" Not an accusation, a question from someone who knew what wrong looked like. Dehydration, fever, something in his chest when he breathes. She pulled back the edge of her jacket, and the lamplight from the patrol wolf's torch caught Cade's face. The ash grey of it, the shallow work his ribs were doing, the way his eyes didn't quite track. The younger patrol wolf said one word to his partner, a name, and his partner was already moving, already lifting a radio from his belt. "Can you walk?" the younger one asked her. She had been walking for 2 miles through a quarry on a bad knee in the dark. "Yes," she said. He looked at her the way people looked at you when the answer you just gave them was not the answer your body was giving, which was a different, more accurate answer. But he didn't argue with her. He turned and he said, "Follow me. The station is 8 minutes." She followed him. The 8 minutes felt like something that had been stretched and then not put back correctly. The patrol station was a low stone building with a light burning in the window that looked, from the outside, like every outpost she had ever seen at territory borders. Functional, blunt, built to last and not to charm. Inside it was warm, and the warm hit her the way things hit you when you've been cold so long you've forgotten what the other thing felt like. Her knees tried to stop working. "Here." The younger patrol wolf, his name was Idris, she learned later, and he had 2 daughters at home and a wife who made bread on Sundays, pulled out a chair and she sat in it, and Cade stirred against her chest with something that was almost a complaint, and she thought, "Yes, keep complaining. Complain forever. I want to hear it." The older patrol wolf was on the radio. She caught fragments. Medical. 5 weeks. Eastern outmost, and then a longer pause, and then something that made both wolves in the room go still. "He's coming himself," Idris said. She did not understand the significance of this until Idris's partner, whose name was Burgund, and who had 20 years on the job and the expression of a man who had not been surprised by anything in at least a decade, looked at Cade in her arms, and then at Tam, and then back at the radio with an expression that was unmistakably surprise. "Who's coming?" she asked. The Alpha Burgund said, like the definite article was load-bearing. "Cale doesn't." He stopped, started again. He monitors patrol channels. He heard the call. Another pause. He was already in the eastern forest. She did not have time to decide how she felt about this, because Cade's breathing changed. Not better. The spaces between his breaths grew longer, and the sound that came with each one became a small, strained thing, and Tam pulled him closer against her chest, and she said, very quietly and with great specificity, "Please, hurry." Idris brought her water. She drank all of it. He refilled it without being asked. She drank that too. The door opened. The cold came in with him. Not the cold from outside, which was real and ordinary and something her body understood. Something else. A cold that came from being in the proximity of something with a great deal of power and no particular interest in making that power comfortable for you. The lamp flame shrank. She noticed it, and filed it next to the knee and the cold hands and all the other things she was going to deal with after. He was not what she expected. She had not let herself expect anything specific, which was a skill she had developed early, because expectations in Irongate had a way of becoming the exact shape of what you didn't get. But she had assumed something. A man who looked like what people said about him. People said Cale Stormhold was the Northern Pack's version of a cautionary tale. They said his wolf was the reason the old Alpha had retired, rather than being challenged. They said he had rebuilt Stormhold from a fractured, bleeding thing into something that 3 territories borrowed from, and none of them tested. He was tall, not tall the way men sometimes were as an accident of genetics, but tall in the way of something that had decided to be that way. Dark hair, cropped close, a jaw that was doing a lot of work holding a face together that had clearly seen weather and difficulty, and had opinions about both. A scar that curved from his left ear to the edge of his chin, wide enough that whatever had made it had been interested in being remembered. He stepped into the room and his eyes went to the pup, and for a moment she could see exactly what was happening behind his expression, which was the particular calculation of a person with power deciding whether to use it and how fast. Then his eyes moved to her. She had been looked at before. Looked at the way furniture got looked at, which was really a look at the space the furniture occupied, rather than the thing itself. This was not that. This was the look of something that had excellent senses and was currently using all of them and receiving information it had not anticipated receiving. He stopped moving. He was 4 feet from her, which seemed both very close and, given whatever was happening in the middle of her chest, not close enough. She did not know where that thought had come from. She put it with the knee and the cold hands. "He needs your healer," she said. "Please." The please came out in 2 pieces because of a cough she hadn't managed to stop. "His name is Cade. He's 5 weeks old. He's the son of Irongate's Alpha." Something moved across his face, a fast, complex thing. "Why," he said, "does the Alpha of Irongate's son require your intervention?" She met his eyes. She was not in the habit of meeting the eyes of people with power, because in Irongate, that had been the kind of thing that started conversations you didn't want to have. But she met his. "Because I went to check the whelping room," she said, "and he was alone in a horse blanket in the corner with nobody coming. And I heard Oscar's mate tell the kitchen staff 3 days ago that they didn't need to keep preparing the feeding schedule. And I know what that sentence means." The silence in the room was thorough. Bergund had stopped moving. Idris's hand rested on the table near the radio and did not lift. Cale's jaw tightened. It was a small movement and it changed the entire tenor of the room. "Give me the pup," he said. She did not move. "I'm not going to harm him," Cale said, and his voice had shifted into something lower and more careful, the voice of a man who has recognized the situation and adjusted accordingly. "My healer is 4 minutes behind me. I need to assess him." She gave him Cade. The transfer happened slowly, her hands not quite willing to let go, and his hands coming in underneath with a steadiness that surprised her. Big, scarred hands holding an infant with a particular competence of someone who was familiar with things that needed to be held carefully. He examined the pup with a thoroughness that had nothing performative about it, 2 fingers checking the pulse, a palm checking temperature, his thumb lifting the corner of one tiny eyelid to check the response. "Malnourished," he said. "Dehydrated. The breathing is a lung infection, early stage." He looked at Bergund. "Tell Vera 2 minutes, not 4. Bergund moved to the radio. Cale looked back at Tam. He did it the same way he'd done it before, the full attention way, and she had the sudden and specific feeling of being read, which was uncomfortable and not entirely unwelcome, which was a contradiction she did not have room for right now. "You cross the quarry," he said. "Yes. From the east wall, the drainage channel. That's a 40-foot climb on a bad slope." She did not say anything. He looked at her knee, the way she'd been not putting weight on it without quite realizing she was doing it. "You're injured." "He's more injured." Something happened in his face that she could not fully classify. Not a smile. Something that had decided not to become a smile but had thought about it. The door opened again and the healer came in, a woman in her 50s with short cropped hair going silver and a bag over one shoulder and an expression that said she had been woken up for this and she would need a convincing reason to forgive it. She saw Cade in Cale's arms, and the expression changed into the face of someone who has just received a very specific kind of information and is integrating it rapidly. "Give him to me," she said, and Cale did, and the woman, Vera, laid Cade on the cleared table and unwrapped him with hands that moved like they already knew what they were looking for. "How long has he been like this?" "At minimum 4 days without proper feeding," Tam said. "I don't know when the fever started. His breathing has been like that for, I don't know. I found him 2 hours ago." Vera looked at Cade's chest, at the way it rose and fell. She pressed 2 fingers below his collarbone, and her face did a thing that Tam had learned in 7 years of watching adults try to keep information from each other, to read as concern being carefully contained. "Antibiotics," Vera said to no one in particular. "Rehydration feed. Warming." She looked up at Cale. 40 minutes, he would have been past the point where this kind of intervention was enough. The sound Cale made was not loud. It came from somewhere behind the human register, in the frequency that set teeth on edge and made small animals reconsider their options. The lamp flame shrank again. "Will he recover?" Tam asked. Vera looked at her with the directness of someone who respected the question enough to answer it honestly. "With intervention, starting now, yes. He'll need 2 weeks of careful management and consistent feeding." "But yes," Tam cried. She did not plan to. She had not cried in years, not when her mother had died when she was 14, not when Oscar's mate had reduced her rations the winter before last, for some infraction she'd never been clearly informed of, not when she had crawled out of the drainage channel an hour ago and understood for the first time that she might have broken something in her knee that she could not afford to have broken. She did not cry for any of those things. She cried because Vera said yes. It was a very short interval of crying. She stopped it because she had practice, but she had not managed to stop it before Quayle saw it, and when she looked up he was watching her with an expression that she had no precedent for in her experience of people with power, which was extensive and not in a hopeful direction. It was not pity. It was something quieter than pity and more present, something that had looked at her and recalibrated. He sat down across from her, not close, not hovering, just present, the way a fire was present in a room, warmth without demand. "What's your name?" he said. Not a question. She had heard questions her whole life and knew what they sounded like. This was something else. "Tam, what's your rank in Irongate?" Stable hand. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and the trees were doing what trees did in wind, that long traveling sound that moved through them from far away. "You crossed a quarry border alone in the dark," he said, "with a sick pup on a damaged knee after 2 miles through standing water, because a beater's mate said they didn't need the feeding schedule anymore. Yes, and you're a stable hand." She understood the subtext. "I know what it looks like." "It looks," he said carefully, "like someone who made a decision that very few people would have made." She didn't know what to do with that. Compliments in her experience had been the thing that came before you understood what they cost. She was still waiting to understand the cost. He didn't rush to fill the silence. "I'll need to go back," she said, not because she wanted to, because she had run out of the ability to pretend she didn't understand what happened to people who crossed borders without permission and wouldn't be coming back. "I know the procedure, border violation. I'll submit to whatever. You won't go back." She looked at him. "You're not going back to Irongate," he said. "Not tonight. Not until I've had a conversation with their alpha about what I found in a 5-week-old pup and who was responsible for it. They'll say I stole him. that I'm unstable, that I have a history of. She stopped because she was about to say things that were true, but that she had never said aloud, which was its own kind of border to cross. Of what? She looked at the table. Of making problems. By which they mean, Cale said slowly, making things that are problems visible. She said nothing. Vera, he said without turning his head. When you're satisfied the pup is stable, I'd like you to look at her knee. Vera, without looking up from Cade, I can do two things at once. Come here. She went. The knee was badly sprained, one ligament torn partway through, which Vera informed her with the bluntness of someone who thought softening medical information was an insult. She wrapped it efficiently and without sentimentality, which was exactly how Tam would have wanted it if she had been asked. And she hadn't been asked, but the outcome was the same. She did not look at Cale while this was happening. She was aware of him in the way she had learned to be aware of things that were large and uncertain. Peripheral. Constant. There's something else, Vera said. Her hands had paused on Tam's arm just above the wrist, on the inside where the skin was thin. There was a mark there that Tam had always had, a small cluster of scars that had looked like a burn since childhood, that she had assumed came from a fever she'd had when she was 3 or 4, when her mother had been in the Irongate pack and things were different. It had never hurt. It had never done anything. She had never thought to investigate it because in the economy of her life, questions about old scars had ranked well below questions about whether she would eat. Vera turned her arm to the lamplight. Hold still. Cale crossed the room and stood behind Vera. He looked at the marks. Tam felt him go still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a person who has seen something they needed a moment to process without showing it on their face. What is it? She said. Vera set down her instruments. She looked at Cale in a way that carried weight, the way two people who had known each other for a long time exchanged information in shorthand. These, Vera said quietly, are suppression marks. Tam waited. Someone, Vera continued, her voice precise and careful, marked your skin when you were very young. Old technique. Blood magic. She traced the shape of the scars without touching them. This pattern is specific. It's designed to keep a wolf dormant, sealed. Tam heard the words. Her brain accepted them individually and then did not know what to do with them in combination. I don't have a wolf. You do, Cale said. His voice was different from how it had been, controlled in a way that suggested effort. She's been suppressed. That's not possible. I was at the shifting ceremony. Nothing happened. The whole pack watched. The whole pack watched the suppression work exactly as it was designed to. He looked at her and she could see something moving in his eyes, something she didn't have a name for yet, some calculation being superseded by something more immediate. Someone did this deliberately. Someone who knew what they were doing and had access to you when you were very young. Why would anyone do that? I'm a stable hand. The silence that followed that sentence had a quality she could not interpret. Vera, he said, show her the reference. Vera went to the patrol station's small shelf of reference materials. It was not a library. It was the kind of minimal inventory of critical texts that border outposts carried, 3 or 4 books, worn, practical. She pulled one and opened it to a page that had been bookmarked at some distant point in the past, and never unbookmarked, the page slightly softer than the others from use. She held it for Tam to see. The illustration was old, the ink gone brown at the edges, but the pattern was clear. A cluster of small scars, 5 marks in a specific geometry. Beneath it, text in the old script that Tam could not read. This suppression is not general, Vera said. It's specific. It was designed for one kind of wolf. She looked at Tam over the edge of the page. There is a bloodline, old, pre-council, the Stormborn. Tam waited. They were the original mediators, Cale said, before the council system, before pack territory boundaries were formalized. They could move between packs without triggering territorial response because they carried something the other wolves recognized at a genetic level. Something that said, he stopped. Something that said, not a threat, not a challenge, a bridge. What happened to them? The council decided bridges were inconvenient, Vera said, with the dry precision of someone who had thought about this for years. A wolf that could move freely between territories was a wolf that couldn't be controlled by any one territory. They were declared extinct. The line was said to have ended 2 generations back. Tam looked at the mark on her wrist, at the cluster of small scars that she had carried for 20-something years and filed under things I will never understand. My mother, she said. She was in Iron Gate before I was born. She said my father, she said he passed through, that she didn't know what pack he was from. Kale said nothing. She looked up. You knew, she said, not an accusation, more like watching a door open into a room she didn't know had been there. I didn't know about you specifically, he said. I had heard the line wasn't extinct. He stopped. I had been looking. My wolf has been. Another stop. The careful ones, she was starting to understand, were not gaps in what he wanted to say. They were places where what he wanted to say was large enough that he was choosing the right part of it to offer first. She looked at him. He looked back. The thing in her chest that she had been ignoring since he walked through the door pressed against the inside of her ribs with a steadiness that reminded her of a tide. Not urgent, just consistent, just there. I don't understand what's happening, she said. Yes, you do, he said. You understand it the same way I do. She was quiet for a long moment. Cade made a small sound from the table, a stronger sound than before, a sound with more intention in it. Vera murmured something low and reassuring and adjusted the warming cloth. My wolf, Tam said, if the suppression were removed, what would happen? She would come through, Vera said. The process isn't simple, the marks are layered, it takes time and care and it's not painless. But yes, she would come through, and before that. I go back to Irongate and Oscar says I'm a thief. You don't go back to Irongate, Kale said. Again, flat, certain, the sentence of a man who had already decided this and was not presenting it for debate. You can't just decide that. I know, he said it without flinching. I'm asking. She looked at him. He held her gaze, and she could see the effort it cost him, not the asking, but the holding back of everything else he wanted to do, the wanting that was coming off him in something she could feel but not see, a pressure the air between them was not quite containing. He had been looking for her, he had said. His wolf had been looking. She was a stable hand with a suppressed bloodline and a bad knee and a stolen pup sleeping on a table behind her. She thought about saying all of that, and then thought about Vera saying yes, and the warmth of the lamplight, and the way his hands had held Cade. I want the suppression removed, she said. Before we talk about anything else, I want to know what I am before I decide what I do with it. He nodded once. No argument, no negotiation. It takes time, Vera said. I'll begin the assessment tomorrow morning, when you're rested. They moved to the main Stormhold Lodge before dawn, Cade stable and monitored, Tam in borrowed clothes that smelled like cedar and cold air, which was what Kale smelled like, which she was deciding not to think about. The lodge was not what she expected. Irongate's pack house was concrete and function and efficiency stripped of anything that hadn't proven necessary. This was stone and dark timber and warmth in the walls, and fires lit without being asked. And someone had left a covered plate food outside the guest room door, and she stood there for a moment with the plate in her hands, not knowing what to do with that. She ate everything on it. She slept without meaning to, in a bed that was a real bed, and woke to sunlight and crying from the medical room down the hall, and was on her feet before she was fully conscious. Kale was already there. He had the pup and a warmed bottle and was testing the temperature on his wrist, which was such a specific and unexpected detail that she stood in the doorway for longer than was strictly necessary. Sit down, he said without turning. The knee. How did you know I was there? I always know where you are. He said it simply, without decoration. That's not something I'm doing intentionally. It's just true. He turned, finally, and handed her the bottle and the pup together, and she sat and fed Cade, and the pup ate with the focused urgency of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted, which was a thing Tam understood completely. Cale leaned against the wall across the room, not crowding, not gone. "Erongate sent a message this morning," he said. "Oscar is claiming the pup was taken by a rogue. That you're unstable, dangerous, that you should be returned to face consequences." Her hands tightened. Cade made a small sound of protest. "What did you say?" "I said the pup is under Stormhold protection, and that any further communication on the matter should come from the Alpha directly, not his Beta, and should include an explanation of why a 5-week-old pup was found malnourished and feverish in a horse blanket." He paused. "I have not yet received that communication. They'll come here. I expect so. They'll say things about me. Things that sound true because they're shaped like facts." He looked at her, and his expression did the thing she was starting to recognize as his version of calm, which was not the absence of feeling, but feeling being held very carefully. "Then they can say them to me directly, and I'll ask them to explain the horse blanket." She almost laughed. She caught it. He caught the catching of it. Something moved in his face. She was learning to read him in the way she had learned to read other things in her life: the weather, the temper of the horses, the weight of a silence. He was not easy to read, but he was not trying to be unreadable, which was different. The delegation from Irongate arrived on the 4th day. She watched from the upper gallery, Cade against her chest, the way she had watched things in Irongate from back corridors and hayloft windows for 7 years. Irongate's Alpha she had seen twice in her life. Edric, a big man, tired-looking, with the expression of someone who had been managing a situation for long enough that he'd stopped expecting it to improve. Oscar was with him, and behind them, someone she had not expected. A woman in her 60s, small and precise, with a cane she used as punctuation, who had been the Irongate Pack's keeper of records since before Tam was born. Her name was Aldith, and she was the person who had been in the room when Tam was 3 years old and burning with fever. And Tam knew this, because her mother had mentioned it once in the careful, edited way. She had mentioned things she thought mattered, but wasn't sure how to explain. She had not told Cale about Aldith. She didn't know what there was to tell. Cale received them in the hall. She watched him the way she'd watched him since the first night, cataloguing the way power actually worked when it was not performed. He did not make himself larger. He did not lean forward. He sat and he let the silence work, and Oscar, who was the kind of man who needed silence to be filled it. The story Oscar told was smooth, administrative complications following the Alpha heir's birth, temporary staffing issues. The girl, she, Tam, had a history of erratic behavior and over-attachment to the animals in her care, had misconstrued a normal situation and panicked. The pup was fine. They were grateful for Stormhold's intervention, and only wished the matter had been handled through proper channels. Cale said nothing for a long time after Oscar finished. "The pup," Cale said finally, "presented with a lung infection, dehydrations consistent with 72 or more hours of inadequate feeding, and core temperature low enough that my healer estimates he was within 40 minutes of irreversible decline." Oscar's smooth expression held. A difficult birth. Complications. The physician was managing multiple demands on his time. "The physician," Cale said, "was attending your son's naming ceremony according to the schedule I requested from the Irongate record office this morning." He looked at Aldith, who filed that schedule. Aldith did not flinch. She had the stillness of very old rocks. "I did," she said. Aldith, Edric said, a warning in the name. Aldith looked at Cale with the directness of someone who had decided something some time ago and was now at the part where decisions became actions. "I filed the schedule," she said again. "I also filed the formal record of the whelping room inspection that was cancelled, and the record of the feeding protocol that was not renewed after the Luna's death. I filed all of them." A pause. "I filed them because I was told to file them, and because I have spent 40 years filing what I am told to file, and I would like, before I am much older, to file something that is true. The silence in the hall was a different quality from the silences Tam had heard before. It had weight. Edric looked at Oscar. Oscar's face had gone through several versions of itself and settled on the one that came after the point where performance stops working. Cale stood. She had watched him stand before. It was still doing something she was not accustomed to, that shift of presence, the way it changed the room's geometry. "Better, Oscar," he said. "You are accused of neglect of an alpha heir, falsification of care records, and the submission of a fraudulent account to a neighboring alpha. If your alpha wishes to dispute any of this, the documentation is available." He looked at Edric. "Your heir is healthy. He is being cared for. I have no interest in holding the child from his father indefinitely. I do have significant interest in ensuring that whatever conditions led to this situation are no longer the conditions he returns to." Edric's jaw worked. "The beta acted without my knowledge. Then act with your knowledge now." The pause was long. Edric was a tired man who had been managing a situation. She could see him deciding whether this was another situation to manage or whether he had arrived, finally, at the place where management ended. "What are your terms?" Edric said. The terms took an hour to work through. Oscar was removed from his position before the delegation left. Aldith was formally requested to remain in Stormhold as a witness to the documented record, which she accepted with the composure of someone who had packed a bag before she came. The heir would remain in Stormhold care, pending a formal review of Irongate's pack leadership that the Inter-Territory Council would conduct. Tam watched all of it from the gallery. Cade slept through the hour, indifferent to the political reconstruction occurring 2 floors below him. One fist curled around her thumb with the grip of something that knew exactly who it was holding and had made its preference clear. The removal of the suppression marks took 3 sessions over as many days. Vera was methodical and unsparing about what it would feel like, which Tam appreciated, because what it felt like was considerable. Each mark broke like a bone resetting, a sharp structural shock that moved through her body from the outside in, and each one released something, a pressure she had not known was there until the moment it eased. After the 4th mark broke, she heard something she had never heard in her life. Her own wolf. Not as a sound exactly, as a presence, a consciousness adjacent to her own, pressing against the inside of her chest with a patience that told her it had been pressing for a very long time and had learned to do it without urgency. "She is angry," Tam said to Vera. "No," Vera said. "She is awake." The last mark broke on the 3rd day, and Tam shifted in the meadow behind the lodge, with Vera standing at a careful distance, and Cale 10 feet away with his hands at his sides and his face doing that thing again, the thing that was not a smile but had thought about being one. The wolf that came through was not what Tam expected. She had not expected anything specific. She had spent her life not expecting things, but she had perhaps expected something proportionate to herself, something that fit the 7 years of stable hand and careful invisibility. What she was large, large enough that Vera took a half step back, not from fear but from reflex. Silver grey, the colour of quarry stone in morning light, with eyes that were amber in human form and something else as a wolf, something that caught the light and held it differently. She stood in the meadow with her paws wider than she expected, and the world was enormous and close and detailed, and she could hear the heartbeat of every animal in the forest and the smoke from the lodge chimney, and, beneath all of it, steady as a tide, Cale. She turned her head and looked at him. He went to one knee. Not submission, recognition, the way you acknowledged something that had the right to be acknowledged. She shifted back on the grass and sat there, her knees still remembering what it meant to be human, and he crossed the meadow and sat down beside her without being invited, which was the only time he had ever done that, and it felt like what it was, the first time he had stopped waiting. "You knew," she said, "that whatever I was, it was going to be something like this." "I knew you were my mate," he said. "I knew that the first night in the patrol station." Everything else I know about you I learned the same way you learned it. She thought about that, about the horse blanket, about the drainage channel, about the way Cade had held onto her thumb. I want to go to Irongate, she said. When things settle, I want to see Aldith. She's here. I want to see her properly, not as a witness, she didn't have the word for it yet. He didn't offer one. He waited, the way he had learned to wait, or the way he had always known how. She was in the room when I was 3, Tam said, when whoever did the marks was doing them. I've been thinking about why she filed those records. For 40 years she filed what she was told, and then she filed what was true. She looked at the meadow, at the grass where her wolf had stood. I'd like to know what changed, then we'll find out, he said. He reached across and his hand rested against hers, not taking, just present, the way he had been present since that first night, warmth without demand, and she turned her hand over and let his fingers close around hers. And the bond that had been a low constant hum since the patrol station opened into something larger and quieter at the same time, the way a door opened into a room with high ceilings. The ceremony was 3 weeks later, when the snow had started and the lodge smelled of pine resin and something baking, and 200 wolves filled the courtyard and the inner hall, and Cade sat in Vera's arms in the front row because Vera had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the person who held Cade during things that required both of Tam's hands. She wore grey, the colour of quarry stone in morning light, which was not an accident. Cale stood at the end of the hall and watched her walk toward him, with an expression she had been learning to read for 3 weeks and had finally understood. It was not composure, it was a man at the very edge of composure, holding it carefully, the way you held something you were afraid of dropping. She reached him, she took his hand. The vows were old. She said them in a voice that did not waver, and he said them looking at her the way she had always needed to be looked at, and had never allowed herself to want, which was as if she were the answer to a question he had given up expecting an answer to. He marked her. The pain was brief and specific and then was not pain at all, and she marked him back, and the hall erupted. Cade, in Vera's arms, was startled by the volume and then delighted by it, and made the loud shapeless sound of an infant who has decided that whatever this is, it is good, and Tam heard it through the howling of 200 wolves and laughed, and Cale heard her laugh, and his face, finally, broke open completely into something unguarded and unreserved. Later, when the fires had banked and the hall had emptied and the snow was falling past the high windows, she sat on the floor of their quarters with Cade in her lap and the wooden blocks someone had left in the basket by the hearth. Small, careful carvings, animals on each face. She learned later that Idris had made them, and Cale sat across from her with his back against the chair legs and the formal ceremony behind both of them, and the fire doing what fires do. Edric has formally renounced custody, Cale said. He asked that I tell you he knows it was your intervention that gave the pup the chance to survive. He asked that Cade be told, when he's old enough, that his father chose what was right over what was convenient, or tried to. She was quiet for a moment. Do you believe him? I believe he believes it. A pause. I believe the difference between trying and doing is something he'll spend a long time working out. Cade grabbed one of the wooden blocks and threw it with the decisive arm of an infant who has something to say. It bounced off Cale's shin. Cale looked at it, picked it up, set it within reach. Good arm, he said, which was exactly what she had known he would say. And she didn't know how she had known, except that she was learning to know him the way you learned things you already were partly made of. Outside the window the snow came down steady and quiet, and the moon was somewhere behind the clouds. Not visible but present, the way things you had always carried were present even before you knew their name.